Okay, I think we can get going, and we will let people drop in as they find their time. Welcome everyone to this webinar, and I'm really happy that you are here, and especially that all these brilliant panelists, or it's actually not a panel, but presenters, experts, activists are here. We will get to them, of course, in a minute. So people are still dropping in, but it's 5 minutes past. So yes, welcome. My name is Lina Hjertström. I'm joining you from Stockholm in Sweden, where the nuclear umbrella named NATO has just placed its shadow, and it's also nighttime outside, 9 p.m. here. And I'm very excited to spend my late evening with you all as moderator for this webinar. I am working with ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. I'm sure you all know the campaign, and I'm working on the positive obligations of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which are victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance. And of course, a key part of ICAN's work with the positive obligations is to work with affected communities and to raise awareness and educate about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And today, tonight, this morning, wherever you are in the world, we will hear from 5 speakers, all with great expertise in their respective fields. And they will give their presentations one by one first. And after that, we'll have time for questions and discussions. So some technical instructions. Most people are familiar with Zoom by now, but just to let you know how we'll run this. There is a Q&A function, questions and answers, down in the menu at the bottom. And if you have any technical issues, then you can get in touch with the host through that function. I also recommend you to try and go out, restart the program, and join again via the same link if you have connectivity issues. And you can also, of course, put questions into the Q&A box. And we'll gather them up towards the end. And just to make that easier for me, who will be the person to gather them up, I will read them when we get to that section. So please be as clear and as brief as you can, so that I will be able to bring your questions into the discussion with as clearly as possible. And for everybody's information, we are recording this webinar, and you should have gotten a notice of that when you entered. And yes, now that you've gotten used to my voice a bit, I want to invite you all who are listening and participating, of course, to take this opportunity to really listen to the stories and the knowledge that our presenters will share with us tonight. Make sure that you are sitting comfortably in a nice space where you can really listen. Plug in your headphones if you have them to reduce distractions. Find something to drink. Take a few breaths and put the Zoom window to full screen so that you can really devote your full attention to what you're hearing. Or, whatever works for you to give you this opportunity to really take in what you're about to hear and learn from our participants today, because we have a very important topic to talk about. As I don't think anybody could have missed who follows ICAN or any of the other organizations present here today, March 1st was the 17th anniversary of the nuclear test called Castle Bravo in the Marshall Islands, the biggest, but by no means the only, nuclear test conducted by the United States in the Marshall Islands and elsewhere. And in this webinar, we will hear about the legacy of nuclear testing and how the effects are spread out over space and over time and still very much ongoing today. We will hear from the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. We have 2 of their staff joining to share about their work on a Human Rights Council resolution that is working to address the human rights challenges caused by the nuclear tests. And we'll hear from civil society, of course, from the Marshallese Educational Initiative, an organization based in Arkansas in the US, where many Marshallese relocated to after the nuclear tests. We will hear from the Pacific Conference of Churches, an ecumenical organization working in Pacifica on, among other things, nuclear justice. And kicking us off in just a little bit will be Melissa Park, Executive Director of ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, who will join us from Geneva. And Melissa took up the position as Executive Director with ICAN only last year, but her engagement on issues of nuclear disarmament and nuclear justice goes back through her career, including as a champion for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, as an ambassador for ICAN Australia. So also a bit back to the Pacific. Yes, the floor is yours, Melissa.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I want to acknowledge those speakers coming after me as the experts in this event. I just want to make some general remarks. In this webinar, we're marking the 70th anniversary of Castle Bravo, the US's largest ever nuclear weapons test, around 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 70 years of injustice, ongoing health impacts through succeeding generations, lasting environmental contamination, and the associated displacement and loss of culture. 70 years without adequate acknowledgement, compensation, or remediation. The documentary film Nuclear Savage tells the story of the ongoing health and other impacts on Marshall Islanders of Project 4.1. And the title of that project was taken from a recently classified document dated in 1953, showing that the US Department of Energy clearly intended the Marshall Islander people to be guinea pigs in the Castle Bravo test. It was not an accident of wind direction, as portrayed afterwards by the United States government. The US conducted a total of 67 nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands and maintained a culture of secrecy around them for decades. It's worth recalling that the Marshall Islands were under the trusteeship of the United States at the time of the nuclear weapons tests, a gross violation of the duty of care entrusted to it by the United Nations. Some Marshall Islanders have been permanently displaced from their atolls and are unable to pursue their traditional lifestyle and culture, including food, due to the contamination of the land and marine environment. Women are especially vulnerable to ionizing radiation since it affects the female reproductive tissue. Radiation poisoning has led to infertility, stillbirths, and birth defects. Children are especially vulnerable to radiation because they are still growing. With radioactive waste and soil having been deposited by the US in the crater of a previous nuclear test and covered over with concrete in the 1970s that is starting to crack, the Runit Dome is an ongoing threat to the marine environment and the people of the Marshall Islands as the sea level rises due to climate change. Seawater is already creeping in and out of the dome. And so in the Marshall Islands and elsewhere in the Pacific, we're seeing the twin existential challenges of nuclear weapons and climate change coming together in the same place. Both legacies of colonialism, racism, and exploitation of people and the environment for wealth and power. The insidious health and environmental effects of radiation from nuclear weapons only became widely known to the world following the contamination of a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon that had been about 86 miles east of Bikini Atoll at the time of the Castle Bravo explosion. As I learned when I visited the Daigo Fukuhiro Maru Museum in Tokyo in January, The Lucky Dragon's crew were all exposed to radioactive fallout and almost immediately started experiencing symptoms of radiation sickness. Upon their return to Yaiko port in Japan some 2 weeks later, the fishermen were hospitalised. And the issue became national and worldwide news, especially when the ship's radio operator, aged 40, died a few months later in September 1954, saying he hoped he would be the last person to die because of nuclear weapons. The rain that fell in Japan months after the test was found to be contaminated with radiation. Local Japanese women took up a consumer campaign to raise awareness about contaminated tuna that they did not want to feed to their children, showing again how nuclear weapons are not distant national security instruments, but weapons that create harm, and the importance of affected communities organising and protesting. The Castle Bravo test was 9 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the radiation impacts of nuclear weapons were not widely known in Japan until after Castle Bravo and the fishing vessel incident. Until then, Japanese hibakusha had suffered a great deal of discrimination and stigma following the atomic bombings because Japanese people did not realise that the illnesses the hibakusha were suffering were the result of radiation poisoning. And this incident shows how important it is that we keep talking about and learning about the tests in the Marshall Islands, because we don't know how little we would have known about the fallout at the time if it hadn't also reached Japan, even though the harms were even worse for the people of the Marshall Islands. The impact from Castle Bravo on the Lucky Dragon's crew led to scientific and public understanding about the radiation effects of nuclear weapons and a new appreciation in Japan and the world of what the Hiroshima and Nagasaki hibakusha had experienced and why nuclear weapons were particularly dangerous. In fact, it was learning about Castle Bravo that led to Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein and others issuing their manifesto in 1955, the last thing Einstein did before he died, in which they highlighted the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and called for world leaders to seek peaceful resolutions to conflict. The evidence of contamination of fish and islands thousands of miles from the Castle Bravo test site, and evidence that emerged over the decades about the experiences of other nuclear weapons test victims, many of them Indigenous, from the Pacific, Australia, North America, Algeria, Tibet, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, has led to the global realisation that nuclear weapons are uniquely destructive over space and time and have lasting impacts on human health and the environment. They clearly demonstrate the connections between nuclear weapons and the environment, between nuclear weapons and health, between nuclear weapons and human rights, between nuclear weapons and food security, and so on. The use of 2 atomic bombs in Japan and the more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests around the world are moral injuries that persist to this day, for which little or no compensation or remediation has been made. They are the result of racial discrimination and colonial injustice at its worst, the exertion of dominance through violence, and the idea that violence against certain groups of people is legitimate or even necessary. They present a stark warning about the fate that awaits all living beings from even a limited nuclear war. And this is why it is so important that countries that have not yet joined the TPNW, such as RMI, do so to delegitimise nuclear weapons and put pressure on nuclear weapon states and their allies to disarm as a matter of urgency. It's also the primary means by which the survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing will receive long-awaited victim assistance and environmental remediation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for getting us started and sharing about the horrors that is nuclear testing. And we will move right on to Benedict. And Benedict sorry, I need to change the windows. There we go. I'm trying to depin you, Melissa. Alicia, would you mind depinning Melissa and pinning Benedict?
Yep, no problem.
Thank you. Great. Then finally, I will move on to introducing Benedict Kabua-Madison, who is CEO of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, US-based organization working to raise awareness of Marshallese history and culture and doing direct outreach with Marshallese communities. And he is usually based in the US, but now joining us from Geneva as well. So good evening to you, Benedict, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lena. Yahweh, greetings to everyone. I'm grateful to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons for the invitation to speak and for hosting a virtual Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day event, a national holiday in the Marshall Islands that is now commemorated worldwide to remember and honor the victims and survivors of the US nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands, including marking the 70th anniversary of the Castle Bravo detonation, the largest nuclear device at 15 megatons ever tested by the United States. It is also a day to stand in solidarity with nuclear frontline communities around the world and recommit ourselves to fighting for nuclear justice in a nuclear-free world. The people of the Marshall Islands have sacrificed much for the United States to become the world power it is today. From 1946 to 1958, the US detonated 67 large-scale atomic and thermonuclear weapons above ground, underground, and underwater at Bikini and Enuitak atolls. These tests comprise 80% of all atmospheric tests conducted by the United States in its nuclear testing program and represent 55% of the total yield. These tests were foundational to the United States' rise to superpower status. What did the Marshallese people receive in return? Displacement, loss of homelands and cultural practices, broken promises, nuclear waste, high radiation levels, and sickness and death. It also had little choice but to sign an agreement with the United States that provided inadequate compensation of $150 million for irreversible nuclear damages that will last another 150,000 years. During a US Senate committee hearing last year to renew this agreement, the Compact of Free Association, congressional leaders and Ambassador Yoon, President Biden's special envoy for compact negotiations, claimed that the compact resolved all issues relating to the nuclear legacy. This is false. Despite evidence from eyewitness testimony, reports from independent scientists, and even the United States' own documentary record, US leaders continue to deny the extent of the nuclear damage to Marshallese health and the environment. US documents released in the mid-90s under the Clinton administration a few years after the initial compact was signed show that more atolls and island populations were exposed to nuclear fallout than admitted by the US during treaty negotiation. The monetary settlement provided under the compact as the full and final settlement was based on information hidden from the Marshall Islands. Once this information was known, the Marshallese government submitted a petition, one allowed under the terms of the compact if circumstances regarding the initial agreement have changed. Still, the US government denied the petition even though evidence was based on its own documentary record. The Marshallese people have sought nuclear justice from the United States since the testing period. A formal apology, adequate compensation, the declassification and removal of redactions from all documents about the testing program, and an independent assessment of the nuclear damage are all necessary. Still, these acts alone do not constitute justice. We also expect transparency and accountability. The Marshall Islands deserves a compact agreement based on trust, accountability, and transparency, not the ongoing toxic, deceiving relationship that is an obstacle to achieving nuclear justice. During the congressional hearing, Ambassador Yoon asserted that the United States has no more money to provide to the Marshall Islands for nuclear compensation. However, ICAN reported that the US spent $43.7 billion on nuclear weapons in 2022. And even more concerning, Plowshares estimates that the US will waste $2 trillion on upgrading its nuclear weapons over the next 3 decades. Since the development of the first nuclear bomb, Trinity, 79 years ago, the US has spent more than 10 trillion plus to build a nuclear arsenal. Before their forced removal from Bikini Atoll in 1946, US Naval Commodore Ben Wyatt told the people of Bikini that the tests were for the good of mankind and to end all wars. The US has been involved in dozens of costly military interventions since then. The United States was once the only nation with nuclear weapons. Now 9 nations possess nuclear weapons. There is concern, and rightly so, that nuclear weapons could be used in ongoing wars and by rogue actors. Many tend to forget, however, that nuclear weapons, their production and testing have already produced casualties and deaths, including the Marshallese people. The Marshallese people demand nuclear justice. If there's always money available to pay for more wars and upgrade nuclear weapons, then there is money for adequate compensation for victims' assistance and environmental remediation. Given the amount the United States will provide for current wars and nuclear upgrades, the roughly $2.3 billion the US will provide over the next 20 years under the new compact agreement pales in comparison. These arbitrary numbers will not make the nuclear waste, high radiation levels, and intergenerational health issues disappear or bring back the islands that were obliterated into nuclear ashes. US officials must stop their denial and acknowledge and address the ongoing impact of his nuclear weapons testing program on Marshallese health, environment, and culture. While the Marshallese government must continue to pressure the US to fulfill its obligations, it must also recognize that it is a sovereign nation with the right to act in its people's best interests. To that end, I urge the Marshall Islands government to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Signing the TPNW would not violate the terms of the Compact of Free Association. More specifically, Article 6 of the TPNW does not absolve the United States of its responsibility. The Marshallese people have sacrificed enough for US national security interests. The Marshall Islands can continue to be an ally of the United States and act in the best interest of its own people. By signing the TPNW, the Marshall Islands will move closer to achieving nuclear justice. It is important to note that while we commemorate Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day, the Marshallese people are far more than victims. We are agents of change. We have been raising awareness of the dangers of nuclear weapons since the testing period itself, and will continue to do so, not only to achieve nuclear justice, but so that we may at last rid the world of these weapons of mass destruction, which have so violently destroyed Marshallese health and well-being, cultural identity, lands, and have taken the birth rate from future generations. No one should bear the same heavy burden. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benedict. And I'm always a little taken aback by hearing the stories, even though I've read them multiple times and listened to testimonies. Yes, moving right on. It has now come, let's see if I have gotten the grasp of that. Yes, I have now mastered pinning in Zoom. So it has come to Diego Valladares Vasconcelos Neto, who is a human rights officer working in the Pacific Regional Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and now joining us from the multi-country office of the United Nations in the Micronesian region in Colonia Pohnpei in Micronesia. Great. Diego, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you also, Melissa and Benedict, two very important actors in the fight for reading the world from the dangers and the dangers to human rights of nuclear weapons. I haven't had the opportunity to have bilateral discussions with them, but it's a great honor to be here now with them in this panel. So allow me to introduce a little bit of what is my work and what am I doing here in the Pacific region, and maybe if I have time, share a little bit of the experience. Lina was saying that she was taken aback by hearing the stories, and I had the opportunity with Rafael to be there in the 70th anniversary, to conduct a workshop and to also be on the 78th anniversary of Bikini Day, the day when the bikinis were forcibly removed, we can say, from their ancestral lands. And so all of this in a very interesting way, and a lot of strong impressions that this caused. But let me go first to, let's say, the more um, institutional element of my presentation. So I'm a human rights officer working with the United Nations Human Rights Office, as Lina introduced me. In my current position, I joined it about a month ago only, is a position for established by Human Rights Council Resolution 5135. I'll post in the chat later the link for this resolution, but you can search it as A/HRC from Human Rights Council slash res from resolution slash 51/35. And this resolution is entitled the technical assistance and capacity building to address the human rights implications of the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. The resolution was presented by a series of Pacific countries, mostly Pacific Island countries, also including New Zealand and Australia. And thanks for sharing, Lina. And this resolution uh, takes into account a lot of what has been shared by Melissa and Benedict in their initial statement. So it recalls that between 1946 and 1958, 67 known nuclear weapons were tested in the Marshall Islands while it was under the United Nations stewardship. And it recalls that by that time, since at least 1954, the people of the Marshall Islands had gone to the United Nations as the administration of the Marshall Islands by the U.S. was a trusteeship of the United Nations, and requested these tests to cease. The trusteeship council heard this petition, and a petition of Yacht Builder, I believe, from the USA, that also presented a similar petition. And sorry, sorry, and thank you. And it heard the arguments of the United States, and it did certain recommendations for the US that uh, for them to consider stopping the nuclear tests, and if they don't stop, that they take precautionary measures. Um, but it's very interesting to read the conclusion by the trusteeship council. The final conclusion, there are different proposals on the table. It reports with satisfaction that no enduring health consequences were observed, and everyone that were affected by the Picasso Bravo test were in good health by then, which we all know today it was not true. So but the Human Rights Council took the decision taking that into account. In 1956, again, this is not mentioned by the resolution, but in 1956, again, the people of the Marshall Islands went to the Trusteeship Council, went to the United Nations, say, please stop the tests. And again, they did not have a satisfactory decision. And only in 1958, the tests in the Marshall Islands ceased. The Human Rights Council 5135 also mentions several other elements of this story, some of which already shared, but it mentions and it builds on a very important country visit by the special rapporteurs on the implication for the human rights of the environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and wastes. This also known as the toxics special rapporteur, The then special rapporteur, visited the Marshall Islands and the USA to discuss the nuclear legacy and the consequences, human rights consequences of this uh, of the nuclear legacy from the perspective of it being a toxic that has been exposed to the environment. And it made several recommendations in a report issued in 2012. And in that report, he did report to the Human Rights Council the immediate and continuing effects on the human rights that resulted in fatalities, serious health implications, and the radiation um, that led the environmental contamination and the loss of livelihoods and lands. The special rapporteur also acknowledged the trauma caused by these nuclear tests, the levels of cancer, the birth defects and psychological trauma that it caused, and so he shared with the United Nations a bit of the gendered dimension of these nuclear tests, as um, and the documentary that Melissa mentioned exposes that as well, very graphically, I would say, that how women and girls suffer disproportionately from thyroid cancers and especially reproductive health problems, and the stories of what they call jellyfish babies or grape clusters babies that are born without limbs are very graphic and are very painful for women today. Um, some of the most emotional statements we received was when um, uh, young women from today shared the pain of their mothers and grandmothers speaking about stillbirths and the consequences that happened back in the day, but that still and there are some reports that reproductive health continued to the new generations as well, and many have had that were not alive in the time of the testing have had a number of miscarriages that are not, in their view, were not would not be verified. It would not happen if the nuclear test had never happened. So it's a very painful story for the people of the Marshall Islands, especially for women and girls. And that's a reference in the resolution and in the report. And so the I think the most important, the resolution makes several recommendations, several requests and encouragements for the United Nations to work with the government of the Marshall Islands to improve the health and the environment of the people of the Marshall Islands, that it gives support, including references to the Runit Dome um, and somehow calling on the United Nations to act and to support the country. But in particular, more concretely, it establishes in two substantive paragraphs, two operational paragraphs, and I'll read the first of them, paragraph 11, request the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to cooperate with the government of the Marshall Islands in the field of human rights and to provide technical assistance and capacity building to the National Nuclear Commission of the Marshall Islands in advancing its national strategy for nuclear justice and determining its technical assistance and capacity building needs to pursue transitional justice in its efforts to address the nuclear legacy. So this paragraph that is about technical cooperation, meaning technical assistance and capacity building, looking especially at the National Nuclear Commission, but to the government as a whole, and we interpret it as also including up to civil society, to different actors, is what based my work. So my full-time job right now, I'm here based in Micronesia to be working directly with the National Nuclear Commission and with other important actors, civil society organizations like the one Benedict represents, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, um, the special envoy for nuclear justice and human rights, who has been, I know, with Benedict in his travel to Geneva to address the Human Rights Council, and other actors to increase their capacities to mobilize the United Nations and different resources in their fight for nuclear justice. And as a matter of illustration of what that work will mean, and we're just beginning the work now, um, we had this 2 weeks mission recently to the Marshall Islands, and during which we were there during the Remembrance Week, the Remembrance Day, which is a national holiday in the Marshall Islands, the 1st of March, which this webinar is also in remembrance of. Um, and in that week, we engaged with students, civil society. We attended the session of the Niti Jela, the Parliament of the Marshall Islands. We talked to different representatives from the Parliament, mayors from the affected atolls, from the northern atolls, the mid-range atolls, which are the ones that the US never recognized as having been affected as well by the nuclear tests, and several other actors in the country. We, of course, attended the ceremonies of the 1st of March, which were remarkably touching and very, very important to be there in that moment for us. And we held a 3 days workshop. And in accordance with the resolution itself, our assistance is very much focused on transitional justice. So we held a workshop in which we were focusing on the different elements of transitional justice and the different human rights elements relating to the nuclear legacy. So when I speak about transitional justice, what I mean is a process of coming from a situation of violations of human rights to a situation where these are overcome through truth seeking, participation and consultation, so in an inclusive manner, through justice, and many times this means criminal justice, not necessarily, and reparations, and through guarantees of non-recurrence, which also mean memorialization, remembering what has happened so that we don't repeat the mistakes in the future. So our workshop was really focused on these, and based workshop with very interesting actors attending in the room and online, we managed to we're starting to develop our strategy of support to of technical cooperation with the government of the Marshall Islands in its quest for the nuclear legacy. And finally, I don't know if Rafael was managed to connect. Has he connected? I think he might be having problems. I wrote to him. Uh, just to mention, in case he's not here, Lina, should I just mention a little bit of Rafael's work as well?
Yes, please, if you wouldn't mind, that would
Yeah.
be great. Thank you.
Okay. No problem at all. It's just wasn't sure if he was around. But the resolution, so the paragraph I read, the paragraph 11, is the one that established my work and why I'm here in Pohnpei, working closely with authority, civil society in Majuro. The report also requests us to write a report. The resolution requests us to write a report, submit a report to the Human Rights Council, to the September session this year, 57th session of the Human Rights Council. And this would be a report on addressing the challenges and barriers to the full realization and enjoyment of the human rights of the people of the Marshall Islands, stemming from the state's nuclear legacy, to be submitted to the 57th session of the Human Rights Council. And this report would be followed during that session as well by an enhanced interactive dialogue with the participation of authorities from the Marshall Islands in the Human Rights Council. So based on that work, and as a repercussion of that work, we have seen some, I would argue, unprecedented uptake by human rights machinery, international human rights mechanism, of the importance of the 1st of March and the 70th anniversary, and this anniversary of the Castle Bravo tests and the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. So on the 4th of March, one day before International Disarmament Day and Non-Proliferation Awareness, 14 mandate holders of the Human Rights Council, special procedures, issued a statement, which I will share as well in the chat if Lina doesn't do that before me. They issued a statement remembering nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands and remember nuclear legacy everywhere, and the importance of making nuclear weapons something for the past, and to address the enduring and continuous violations of human rights in the uh, in the context of nuclear legacies everywhere. The same day, on the 5th of March, the day of International Disarmament Day, the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a tweet again calling nuclear legacies to be addressed, justice to be served, and nuclear weapons to be something from the past. And though it did not mention the Marshall Islands specifically, it shared a picture of the Crossroads, the first operation in the Marshall Islands that displaced the population of the Bikini Atolls, of the Bikini Atoll. So that's all to say that through the council bringing this matter and taking this the responsibility to address some of the issues and to build the capacities of the Marshallese themselves to fight for nuclear justice and having ownership of that and achieve transitional justice from this current legacy are the mandate that established my post of Rafael, who is based in Geneva, working on drafting this report and will be working on this enhanced interactive dialogue. We hope to be just one more tool, and one more tool will open some doors and will contribute for giving international visibility to this reinforce and be some support for the steps ahead of the Marshallese people who
I am wondering if we lost Diego's video there, or if it was just a well-timed finish to his presentation. I can see the connection is a little off. Thank you so much, Diego, and thank you also for covering some of your colleagues' work. We were hoping, as you might have noticed by now, to have a second participant from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights who has been unable to connect, but you can find in the chat links to the work that they are doing if you want to see the paperwork and follow the results of the workshops and the reports that I think will be out this fall, right? And you are back. Do you have any finishing words, Diego, or did you?
No, Elena, sorry, apologies. I have a connection issue. I'm still in the hotel. I haven't found a place to in Pompeii yet, as I arrived just a few weeks ago. And so, no, just to conclude, really, to say that we're here and would be very happy to cooperate with ICAN, with the Marshallese Education Initiative, with the World Council of Churches, and all other organizations working to address this nuclear legacy and others, and will be full-time dedicated to this from here in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then we will move on to our last speaker for, I want to say tonight, but today or this morning, depending on where you are joining from. And excellent, I can see that Betty is able to join us with camera as well. We'll hope that your connection is stable. And Betty Rathule is an activist with the Pacific Conference of Churches, working on the nexus of climate justice and nuclear justice, and is from the Marshall Islands, but now based in Fiji, joining us from Suva. And Betty, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yagoe Alep, Kaselelie, and Bulavinaka from Suva, Fiji. My name is Betty. I'm from Ebon and Nauru Atolls in the Marshall Islands, and also from Pohnpei State in the Federated States of Micronesia. Thank you so much to ICAN for having me today, and thank you to my fellow presenters for their contributions to our Buebuenado today. I want to apologize in advance if I have any internet issues. Before I begin, I would like to pay my respect to the survivors and families who have endured and continue to endure the intergenerational impacts of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, as well as throughout the region and world. Today, I would like to talk about the regional impacts of Castle Bravo along with other nuclear tests in the Pacific and highlight the role of youth CSOs and faith-based organizations. As mentioned by Melissa and Diego, the Marshallese people filed several petitions to halt testing on their islands. One of the outcomes was a resolution 1082 by the UN Security Council recommending that if the administering authority considers it necessary in the interest of world peace and security to conduct further nuclear experiments in the territory, it takes such precautions as will ensure that no inhabitants of the territory are again endangered, including those precautionary measures requested by the petitioners. No such measures were taken. Nevertheless, my people persisted and they were not alone. As tests were conducted throughout Oceania in various locations, including Kiritimati Atoll, Mauhinui, also known as French Polynesia, and Australia, and members of different Pacific nations were deployed as part of nuclear cleanup crews, the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement took root. This movement is considered to be the first grassroots regional political movement in the Pacific. In 1970, the ATOM Committee, which stands for Against Testing on Moruroa, was formed and led by concerned youth, particularly the Young Women's Christian Association, Students' Christian Movement, and the Fiji Council of Churches, later the Pacific Conference of Churches. In 1975, they held their first meeting for people working on nuclear issues and later would form the Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific Movement, holding conferences in Pohnpei, Hawaii, and Vanuatu. Among the forces of the Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific Movement, which I will now refer to as the NFIP, were some awe-inspiring Marshallese advocates. One was Jeton Anjane, Minister of Health and Senator of Rongelap Atolls, who worked to get an independent scientific committee to come to Rongelap Atoll, an inhabited island which was heavily contaminated by the Bravo test. Senator Anjane in 1985 worked to evacuate the Rongelap people with the help of the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior. They waited for 30 years to be evacuated. There was also a young Marshallese woman by the name of Darlene Keju, who carried out research on the impacts that nuclear tests had on women in the Marshall Islands. Darlene went on to share the stories of painful trauma of jellyfish babies born without bones or eyes at the World Council of Churches General Assembly in 1983 in her moving address. Netherlands-based Madeleine Helmar, who has worked on Pacific issues, said, her impressive speech tore up the curtain of silence around the nuclear legacy in the Pacific and caused a wave that went as far as Europe, where it landed on the fertile ground of the anti-nuclear movement. The Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific Movement bridged North and South Pacific experiences on nuclear testing, militarism, and human rights, uncovering the threads of freedom and self-determination as an integral strand of the Pacific nuclear movement, and allowing youth and survivors to share their concerns with one another. Pacific youth empowered themselves to talk about issues of military occupation in many parts of their islands, political and environmental impacts of colonization, and the ongoing threat posed by nuclear weapons. What emerged was the Treaty for a Nuclear-Free South Pacific Zone, or the Treaty of Rarotonga, which was signed at the 16th South Pacific Forum in Rarotonga in 1985. Banning the possession, testing, stationing, and storage of nuclear weapons, as well as the dumping of nuclear waste in the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone. Like many treaties, the Rarotonga Treaty isn't perfect and reflects compromise, rather than consensus. It contains loopholes, especially in the context of the newly developed AUKUS Pact by the US, UK, and Australia to deploy nuclear-powered submarines into our region to enhance security. When the treaty was drafted in the 1980s, Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke and New Zealand Prime Minister David Lang put pressure on Pacific nations to word it in a way that would allow the US to sign. They argued that US was better in than out. Provisions were made that allowed nuclear weapons and nuclear-powered ships to transit through the zone, which was heavily criticized by Pacific nations. Despite those provisions, the US never ratified the protocols and remains non-committal despite repeated reminders over the years. Australia's acquisition of nuclear submarines does not violate the treaty by letter, but Pacific nations criticize and have called them out for violating the spirit of Rarotonga. What's more, Australia will host B-52 bombers in transit and therefore aren't in violation of stationing nuclear weapons, but the construction of permanent housing sites for these bombers tell a different story. Ahead of the 70th anniversary of the Castle Bravo test, Pacific CSOs, partners, communities have reflected heavily on our ongoing nuclear legacy. While Oceania continues to deal with the aftermaths of nuclear tests, new forms of nuclear colonialism have taken root, from the use of our oceans as nuclear highways to the dumping of radioactive waste from Japan's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. These issues, coupled with ongoing geopolitical military regime and climate change, are a continuation of the attitudes which sparked nuclear testing in our region in the first place, regarding our islands and oceans as isolated, small, and sparsely populated, when in reality they are a massive network of vibrant islands and coral atolls connected through a vast and abundant ocean. Climate change compounds the struggles of nuclear-affected communities and in some cases, forcing them to relocate for a second time. As Benedict has said, the people of Bikini Atoll were told that they need to relocate for the good of mankind. Reflecting on this sentiment in the current state of our home, my good friend and third-generation displaced Bikinian, Rosenet Timius, says, "My people once had to relocate for the good of mankind. Now we are having to relocate because of mankind." On March 28, the Pacific Conference of Churches gathered virtually with storytellers and church leaders for an online vigil entitled 70 Seconds of Silence. Two third-generation nuclear survivors, Sinapora Yawane from Kiritimati Atoll and Manny Compass from Woodaduk Atoll in the Marshall Islands, shared their families' heartbreaking stories of mistreatment, displacement, and trauma. Manny especially moved people as he had to take much time to pause and gather himself while sharing the story of his grandfather, who said, "Imogin puebenado," which means, "I am tired of telling my story." Manny and Sinaporo reminded us that this issue is real and experienced daily by families throughout the Pacific and globe, and that Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day is a time of great mourning for nuclear survivors and their families. On March 1st, youth in Fiji mobilized to share stories with our counterparts back home during a Puebenado session for young people hosted by the National Nuclear Commission, and to carry out the 7th annual Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day March in Suva, Fiji. Within the past few years, contemporary regional movements like MISA for the Pacific and Young Solwara, who have hosted this Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day March in Fiji, have cropped up. We actually held our first event in 2017, the year that the National Nuclear Commission in the Marshall Islands was established. These movements are enabled through the support of CSOs, faith-based organizations, and INGOs who facilitate intergenerational mentorship and echo the passion and vision of the NFIP. The motto of the NFIP, which was, "If it is safe, test it in France, store it in Washington, and dump it in Japan," is sadly somehow still relevant today. But we have hope. In conclusion, there is a great need to draw upon the foundations of early Pacific nuclear activists and movements for independence, solidarity, and environmental remediation to strengthen the Rarotonga Treaty and enable CSOs, churches, and youth to continue to work together in a unified strategy to ensure that the people of Marshall Islands and Oceania may not endure further harms by the nuclear order. May we never forget our ancestors, our oceans and our islands, their struggle, their resilience, and their dream for a world free from nuclear weapons. Pomotada.
Thank you so much, Betty, for all of your insights and sharing the stories of many people. And now we have switched up the order a little bit. We have Raphael joining us. After all, he's found a connection. So I will, and Raphael Pangalangas is a human rights officer also with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I don't think I've ever said that so many times in a day. At the Environmental and Climate Change Unit, and is working on the report that Diego introduced us a bit to, but I will also give Raphael a few minutes to sort of cram your whole presentation into a shorter version and guide us through the purpose and goals of this report that you're putting together. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Hi, Lena. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm happy that I'm able to present very briefly some thoughts and our approach on this report. So, first things first, I'd like to confirm that you could hear me and you could see me. Yeah, great. I'm seeing some nods. Good to see a number of familiar faces here, and truly an honor to join this panel and this organization on this incredibly relevant topic. So Diego has already touched upon the mandate as well as on the report. So allow me to springboard off that discussion and zero in on some key takeaways from our preparations and in our approach to the report. And what I'd like to emphasize at the outset is how nuclear impacts is more often than not conceived in perhaps the traditional scientific terms of radiological impact. But in reality, what we see is both radiological and non-radiological consequences. That's a historical fact, chronologically speaking, the impact of the nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. One of the, possibly the very first human rights impact was forced displacement prior to any nuclear testing that was conducted. So this paints quite a clear picture how this analysis would involve both a scientific lens. Definitely it would be a part of it, but a colleague of mine put it quite nicely. It's a part of it, but not all of it. So this report will reflect that approach, both a radiological and non-radiological assessment. The second thing that I hope to highlight is how the framework that we've adopted in this analysis builds upon the transitional justice framework. And you see an explicit reference to TJ in the resolution that created this mandate. And what's interesting about this is how it would necessitate a conceptualization of transitional justice as one that is not isolated to any literal transition, so to speak, from dictatorship to democracy, from conflict to peace, but as a framework, as an understanding of justice for legacies of human rights violations left unaddressed. And that is the approach that we have taken for this in advancing this resolution. And perhaps I understand I need to be brief about this. So perhaps what I'll end with is how the mandate aspects that Diego and I work on focus on respectively paragraphs 11 and 12 of the resolution, respectively on capacity building, paragraph 11, and the report to be presented before the HRC in paragraph 12. But this is not to say that they are separate. In fact, they very much feed into each other. And we have conducted missions to the Marshall Islands pursuant to this mandate for stakeholder engagement that feeds into the report, but likewise capacity building in pursuing transitional justice. So perhaps just a very brief note on my end, but should there be any questions, happy to elaborate further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafael, and thank you for adapting and giving us the kind of Cliff Notes version. I don't know if you can see further back in the chat, but we also shared the resources about the resolution so people can follow that if they are interested, and also look out for the report when that is done. So this means we are entering into the Q&A and discussion part of this evening, and I would like to invite everyone who's been listening to post your questions in the chat, and I will give you a little time to do so and to think about what you are curious about, what you want to learn more about. If something was unclear, if there's something that you would like to hear one or several of our presenters elaborate on. And if you don't have questions, I have questions. Of course, I have questions. We have by no means exhausted the work that is being done on this topic. But I will keep talking for a little bit to give you space to think about your questions, or pick and choose between all of your questions. You might have many. We've heard now about effects of nuclear weapons tests, radiological and non-radiological. We've heard about resistance. We've heard a lot about the resistance that people have been putting up, both to end the tests while they were ongoing, with petitions. We've heard protests and organizing. And since the test actually ended, we've heard about work to address the harms and, of course, to end the threats of nuclear weapons. Betty shared with us about a survivor saying he was tired of sharing his story, and that, to me, reminded me of the very great burden that is placed on affected communities and survivors to both deal with these consequences and also try to be the ones to change the world into a world where this cannot happen again, and eliminate nuclear weapons. And we do have a first question from an attendee that says, given the economic vulnerability of the Marshall Islands, who would fund and support them to develop this transitional justice framework? And from the framing of the question, I would guess that that might be for you, Rafael. But anyone, feel free to jump in also. Or Diego was raised.
Yeah, thanks. Very good question, and it's the question that we've encountered in our previous, our earlier engagements on the Marshall Islands itself. And what I can say about the resource aspect of this is that there is a human rights language to be tapped into for the purposes of resource mobilization. This is very much part of that call. It's very much part of that process. It's not only identifying mechanisms in the abstract, but calling for the sufficient resources, may it be financial or capacity or technological, to be pulled together through the duty of international cooperation. So that is an aspect that will be incorporated into the report. It ends with a list of recommendations, and that is one such recommendation which would have its space within the report.
Diego, feel free to add.
Yeah, so just that the element of our work is financed by the United Nations, but it's dependent on the existence of this resolution, right? So the resolution expires, the mandate of this resolution expires in September, and so our capacity for now to contribute to the Marshall Islands in capacity building, technical assistance, elaboration of this report, interactive dialogue, engagement with human rights mechanisms goes until, for now, September, but there is a strong expectation that this resolution will be renewed, and whether it will be the same content, a different one, it's up to member states of the United Nations and especially of the Human Rights Council. So I understand the Marshall Islands and Benedict, together with Senator Anitok, the Special Envoy for Human Rights and the nuclear justice, they have been engaged with conversations on this resolution in Geneva, the permanent mission in Geneva, and what will be the future path relating to the resolution. If it will create more resources from the United Nations to the National Nuclear Commission, that's something that depends on member states. So there's another possibility, as Rafael mentioned. There's this element of compensation that could be discussed by those responsible for the nuclear legacy, but there's also a way to the path to make the United Nations also participate in that responsibility is through creating a mandate, and we don't know yet what will be the mandate beyond September this year. Over.
And back to Rafael.
Yeah, sorry, just very briefly. I think this is a incredibly insightful and practical question that we need to be aware of. And just one other element that I'd like to throw into the picture is that when we speak of finances, we're not only referring to pooling of funds, right? And that's usually how that's more often than not the first thing that comes to mind. But it's not only financial resources, but also financial management that we need to look into. And that is why when we speak of capacity building, we should also be looking into building not only the digits, but the capacity is to manage these funds, to report on these funds in terms of auditing and post-project accounting. And this feeds into that longer term goal, the proverbial teach a man how to fish approach, that this isn't seen as some one-off activity where we raise funds and ended at that, but we're looking at a long-term relationship and development of building RMI capacities locally to be able to apply for grants moving forward, manage these grants well, and in so doing, be able to build a profile, whether through government efforts or through CSO efforts, for further applications and grant efforts moving forward.
Plenty of ideas I can hear, which sounds promising. I want to tie into that a little bit. I was just got me thinking. Sorry, I'm now also trying to read in the Q&A box while talking, and the capacity to do things simultaneously here is a myth. Yes, so I was thinking we had Benedict start us off with also talking about the compact with the US, and we haven't spoken a lot, despite this being an ICAN webinar, about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but that also has provisions in it for victim assistance and environmental remediation and international cooperation and assistance to implement the treaty. So that is also, it's not a way of funding specifically a transitional justice program, but it is a way of joining and provide support and assistance to affected communities, primarily states parties, which the Marshall Islands is not as of today. So I was wondering if I could ask Benedict or Betty if you wanted to comment on or share your thoughts on resources and what are your thoughts on how the international community can, should, must, pick your verb, work more to provide the assistance that is needed in the Marshall Islands? You can also say pass if you want to, but I wanted to hear from you as well on the issue of resources. Benedict, go ahead. Or
Thank you, Lena, for the question. Yeah, certainly the TPNW is something that we should look into in terms of how that could support this mandate. But again, the Marshall Islands has yet to sign and ratify the treaty based on their concerns in regards to the Compact of Free Association. And of course, with that, there's internal discussions on how the government will move forward. In regards to the TPNW. Now, with the Compact of Free Association, as some of you may know, the legislation was passed last week. President Biden signed the COFA, I believe it was on Monday. And we're now waiting on the next step, which would be the Marshall Islands government, parliament, approving the COFA treaty. But under the new treaty, there is $700 million that have been set aside for the Marshall Islands to use however it sees fit. Now the Marshall Islands wants to use this $700 million for nuclear. But according to the US, they are not going to call it that. And so we're still trying to figure out how this nuclear funding will be used. And in fact, I'm currently writing an article on how this $700 million should be used to support communities impacted by nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands.
Thank you for the question. Sorry, did I interrupt you, Benedict, or am I down? Thank you. So, in terms of resources, I do agree with what Benedict is saying, and hopefully I don't repeat anything because my internet cut off for a bit, so I missed a bit. But I think before we touch on that, it's important to acknowledge that when interacting with Indigenous communities and affected communities, there should be an understanding of protocols for engaging with them that, honor and build relationships of respect, reciprocity, two-way communication, learning and sharing, because there has been such a history of extraction, of workshop fatigue and storytelling fatigue. As you've heard from my stories, people are tired of sharing. It can get really difficult and traumatizing to keep resharing without feeling like there are results. And so I just want to preface by saying that. But from my personal point of view, I believe that CSOs are civil society are very much the ones that are, spearheading a lot of nuclear issues in terms of keeping up to date on information, sharing stories, solidarity, trying to engage new audiences. I know our government is doing so much in this area, but we cannot work in silos. And so a transnational strategic meeting for the many actors working in this space would really benefit I think the movement and what we are trying to accomplish, because we haven't had anything where we've tried there has been like a little spark of a coalition of nuclear justice advocates for the Marshall Islands, but I think that we need to really take that off and find a way to strategize and work together that is as powerful or matches up to the way that other movements like the climate movement are working in the global, regional, and national spaces. And also, I believe in terms of resources, yeah, I think that would help to get more information out, get more resources out. And I know that at the Pacific Conference of Churches, when we share with our international partners, church members, they're always asking, what can we do? Where can we collaborate? So we really need those connections. We need to weave that mat of solidarity together and not just work, in one sector, but in all multi sectors. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense to me, at least. Thank you, Betty, and thank you for that, Benedict, for sharing as well. I am not seeing questions, but I'm seeing some cheers and cheering in the chat box, so that's also nice. And tying into kind of what Betty was finishing on with tying webs and networks and collaborating. We are here 2 weeks after the Castle Bravo anniversary. It's 1 week after International Women's Day, 8th of March. And I can't help but draw parallels between organizing for gender equality and organizing for nuclear justice, and of course, a lot of other justice issues, but especially in the ways that both movements have grown tired of waiting for someone else that should take steps, like the nuclear states or the men that rule them and other states, to change on their own. It's sort of the narrative behind the TPNW got tired of waiting around and did something better ourselves on the terms of those who have actually been affected by nuclear weapons and the dangers that they pose, and to work on our own to build something better. So on that, and on what Betty was saying, I want to ask you what are your hopes or fears, but what are you seeing and wanting for the future of the movements for nuclear justice? I will put that question to all of you. I will let Diego in, but since I'm thinking that's not what you wanted to comment on, I also ask you to keep my question in mind, because I'd love to hear your answers.
I'll try to connect, but I just wanted to react to Komultata Kalangan Betty for her comment. And we felt during our mission and as a key element of how the United Nations should work, we felt very much that many people were concerned and skeptical initially, especially because if this is a one-off exercise and if this is a short-term engagement, it's again a reason for people not to say, okay, once again, somebody comes, tries to help, and or says wants to help and then goes. And I agree fully with what Betty said, that really civil society and her movement, Benedict's movement from the US, her movement here in the Pacific have had a very important um, impacts. And so I wanted to first acknowledge that we are here really, and we hope this will be a long-term engagement. We depend on the Human Rights Council, so I have to manage expectations. But we fully understand that this shouldn't be a one-off, shouldn't be a short-term engagement, because this should be a longer strategy. So answering your question and a bit of Betty's call, I hope we can build, and this seminar can serve as one more step towards a coordinated, continuous conversation where a strategy from national authorities and international actors and civil society are all thought together. And one final thing that Betty said that I think it's extremely important is to learn from the successful engagement on other areas like climate change. The Marshall Islands and other Pacific Island countries have had an amazing impact, and some would say almost the Marshall Islands were among the most important actors for the 1.5 ambition call on climate change, 1.5 degrees target. And so I think it was late Tony de Broom who mobilized and started fighting for that 1.5, and people thought he was crazy initially, and then that was achieved to be at least included in the Paris Agreement. So learning from the very successful strategies that national actors, civil society actors have engaged in other fields, building on that knowledge, that know-how, and really working together is the way forward. So I really welcome ICAN for hosting this conversation, and I think that's a very important call for us to coordinate ourselves. Thank you, and break the silos. Thank you.
Always break these silos that never seem to go away, however often we try, but we keep trying. Thank you, Diego. Does somebody else want to come in on that question of the future of the nuclear justice movement? And Raphael, and then Melissa looks attentive. Raphael, please.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for the floor, Lena. So yeah, very much building upon what Betty and what Diego had mentioned. I think this is definitely the right way to approach this, the question and the many questions that we face in the nuclear legacy, a cross-sectoral, cross-thematic, but also a cross-contextual conversation across the nuclear legacies that we see around the globe. I recalled hearing from Betty earlier how there is a comparative analysis and lessons to be derived from nuclear legacies, which do not necessarily refer only to contexts of nuclear testing, but other forms of nuclear radiation. And we see this through, for example, the nuclear legacies that we see in Japan, both with regard to the hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but likewise more recently Fukushima, but likewise the nuclear accidents that we see in Commemorates in Spain and in Thule in Denmark. And there are lessons to be derived there, where we see cleanup and conversations happening in a much more speedily and transparent manner between the US and those respective states than what we see in the Marshall Islands. So all this to say that there is much to benefit from that global conversation, and I completely support this idea that it be pursued. Benedict and I were just speaking yesterday, and he had mentioned to me how there is indeed a global network that the MEI has been building in this regard, and and I'm sure everyone would be interested to hear more on that. And
Yeah,
perhaps
we could,
when it comes to
if Benedict wanted to share on we have 1 minute left.
Oh, I
so
see. Okay. Yeah, let me wrap up on that then. And yeah, happy to hear from Benedict.
I've also said I wanted to hear something from Melissa before we end off, but Benedict, since you are looped in.
Thank you, Raphael and Lena. Yes, so we've actually are building a network of youth from frontline communities. Again, going back to our nuclear stories, our narratives, our communities, we are still trying to learn more about the impact of nuclear on our communities. And, there are still so many people out there who have yet to hear our stories. And our nuclear narratives, that's equal to nuclear justice, and the ultimate goal of abolishing nuclear weapons. And so we're building this network and hoping to include more youth from around the world from these nuclear affected communities. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Melissa, please.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you to all the other speakers. I think it's been really informative and I think very moving presentations, but also quite exciting to see the movement that's happening on these issues now and the attention and the awareness raising that's going on. I note in the chat the comment from David, one of the attendees, about reminding the audience that another 70th anniversary of a detonation is coming up. Castle Romeo was detonated on the 26th of March, 1954 at Bikini Atoll. And then there was Castle Yankee with a yield of 13.5 megatons as the second largest nuclear detonation on May 5th. So I think it is important to remember these anniversaries. So that was one thing I wanted to say. Secondly, I think these issues, the Castle Bravo test and all of the nuclear weapons tests that have happened really remind us that nuclear weapons are connected to so many other issues as well, and that we shouldn't be talking about them in silos, but as part of, human rights, as part of the environment, as issues affecting food security, health, etc. And thirdly, like the appallingly tragic and awful situation in Palestine, what has happened in the Marshall Islands is not only the responsibility of a particular member state, but also of the international community. And so the international community has that responsibility to fix, to make amends for what has happened in the Marshall Islands. And that's why I think things like the Human Rights Resolution and the work of special rapporteurs and their announcements and the TPNW are so important. And so I'll just finish on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, for drawing a lot of the things that we've touched upon tonight in this webinar together. And I wanted to share, I'm going to put in the chat a few links now to the organizations that have participated. The civil society organizations, I should say, the UN links are above in the chat shared earlier, so that you can find them if you're not already acquainted with them. And also, ICAN has been working with partners to collect stories of survivors and activists and putting them on an interactive website called nucleartestimpacts.org, where you can share their stories and take part of them without asking them to do that work over and over again. And you can learn more about the nuclear tests that have happened across the world. So in the Marshall Islands, but also in a lot of other test sites, unfortunately, and about the activists that are working to change this world. So you can find that link too in the chat now. Please visit that site and keep in touch with the organizations that have been here today. I keep saying tonight, but that's just my time zone. And we are 4 minutes over schedule. I apologize for that, but I'm very happy that we got to hear from everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been really interesting. I have learned so many new things, and I hope to keep this conversation going and keep working together to eliminate nuclear weapons and achieve nuclear justice. Thank you so much.